Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ and Friends. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and my guests today are both doctors at TrueNorth Health Center because it's the second Wednesday of the month. That means it's time for Can Fasting Save Your Life? But this time, instead of just having one of the authors, Dr. Alan Goldhamer, I have the other author, Dr. Toshia Myers. I've never met her before, but she's going to be talking about fasting research and give us a scientific perspective. Please welcome them both to the show. It's so nice to meet you, Dr. Myers. I mean, I'm surprised we've never crossed paths.
I know. It's nice to meet you too, Chef AJ. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. So before we introduce Dr. Goldhamer or reintroduce him, because if you watch my show, you know he's been on every month for quite some time and also many times before that. I'd love to know a little bit about you and how you hooked up with True North and hooked up with Dr. Goldhamer to write this book, how you got interested in this or even in a plant-based diet in general. What's your background?
Yeah, so I have a background that is quite different. My training, my educational background is quite different from this line of work. I started training as a geneticist and cell biologist, and that's what I have a PhD in. So I studied that for a very long time. And it was sort of during my PhD years when I was at Columbia, I had started developing a lot of symptoms like acne, asthma, allergies, right? And I was in my early 20s and I was going to the doctor and they were just trying to load me with all these medications. And I just realized this doesn't seem right. I'm 20, I'm otherwise healthy, and they want me to take like 10 different medications. And so I started looking at my diet, and then I got really interested in natural hygiene and started reading, Shelton and a lot of the old literature from the hygienists. And my health started to turn around completely at that point. Like all of the inflammation started to go away. And so I just really at that same time realized that even though my PhD was in very basic type of science, we always had to have some sort of sentence in our manuscripts and our grant proposals that sort of linked it to drug development. And this is when I realized that that path wasn't for me.
It's interesting that your first book was Dr. Shelton because that's not always the first book that brings people into this way of eating.
No, I was just reading a lot, and there's a guy named Arnold Ehret, and he wrote some really interesting books. And I don't know, so I just sort of went down this rabbit hole of all of this sort of thinking about how diet affects health. And at that time, I hadn't really heard very much about that.
How old were you at the time, in your early 20s?
Yeah, I was around 21 or something.
And so did you change your diet immediately or did you lean into it?
I did, and I mean, I've never been a diet fanatic, but I just cut out all of the white foods from my diet, all the processed foods. And so basically, I stopped eating highly processed foods at that time.
So fast forward to today, how did you hook up with Dr. Alan Goldhamer working at True North and writing this book that's been long awaited?
Yeah, so that's a funny story as well. So I had left my final postdoctoral position and I sort of didn't know what I was going to do. And I had some time. And so I actually did a fast. I had been following Alan for a long time because I was interested in hygiene and fasting. And during that fast, I was like, I want to do fasting research. And a couple of weeks later, Alan sent a newsletter from TrueNorth Health Center looking for a research director for the foundation. And even though my training wasn't necessarily in clinical research, I had all of this interest and experience in natural hygiene. And so I just reached out. And so I've been working for the foundation for almost a decade now, actually. It'll be 10 years this August.
That is amazing. And I can't believe we've never run into you. Dr. Goldhammer, so tell us a little bit about how you discovered Tasha, Dr. Meyer.
Well, we had realized that, when we did our first papers, Dr. LIsle and myself, we realized we really needed some skill sets that we didn't have on our staff. And so we reached out through our newsletter to see if anybody knew somebody that actually was a real scientist that would be interested in helping us move our research agenda forward. And fortunately, Dr. Myers saw the notice and I'll give myself credit. It didn't take me but 2 minutes to realize that this was a gold mine that needed to be brought in. And she was able to be convinced to move to California and has been with us ever since. In fact, it was interesting. The very first thing she did when she got there, she helped us publish that paper in British Medical Journal Case Reports on lymphoma, which, we had been struggling so hard to get anything read and published. But as soon as she came in, it was like, boom, we had a case report in VMJ Case Reports. And that was a really auspicious start. And of course, now since then, she's published 22 papers, I believe, in the peer-reviewed literature and wrote Can Fasting Save Your Life, which is really a Herculean task that she was able to complete last year. And it's I'm so grateful that we've been able to do that, because that was really an important step in our forward progress plan. And now we're able to kind of move on to phase 2 in terms of a different type of research. And of course, the center's grown substantially, in large part because of the exposure that we've gotten as a result of this research.
Yeah. Dr. Myers, was this your first book?
Yes, it's my first book, maybe my only book.
What's it like working with Dr. Goldhamer?
I really enjoy working with Dr. Goldhamer. I think we have very different personalities, and one thing I appreciate about him is his optimism and his forward thinking. So, and then I keep us grounded. So we're like a good team. He's always moving forward, and I'm always grounding us. And I think it really works out.
Right.
Also, I'm not a very reverent person, so I don't put him on a pedestal, which I think helps us have a relationship.
Oh, go ahead, Dr.
Yeah, no, there's no question. One of the things that Dr. Myers brings in, which is really important, is she's actually a real scientist, not just a clinician, but a person that really understands science and the scientific methodology. And so it keeps us from being unrealistically optimistic. We have to have a much more grounded base. In other words, in order for us to push something forward, we have to get it through her, and her filter is very efficient and effective. And so it's been very helpful to keep us from going into areas where we would be making mistakes or making assumptions that aren't valid. And if you look at Can Fasting Save Your Life, you'll see it's a real difficult challenge, taking complex scientific things, but writing them in a way that people can actually understand them. And that's one of the skills that she brings in, is the ability to understand the science, but actually communicate it in a way that a normal human being can actually process the information in a realistic way. That's been, I think, really helpful, but also being accurate enough that clinicians and other scientists look at it and think, oh yeah, this looks real credible. It doesn't have, it's not sloppy.
Yeah. Dr. Myers, when you did your first fast, what benefit did you have, and have you done subsequent fasts?
Yeah, so I had been fasting with other methods before I had done the prolonged fasting. And I think, like everybody, I was afraid to just drink only water, right? I mean, but it had a profound effect on me. I actually had some, tissue in my breast that felt really lumpy at that time, and it completely went away. Lots of just small things, I didn't have any major problems, but there was just lots of things in my body that sort of cleared up with the fasting. And so I was really blown away, because I believed that the fasting, would potentially be beneficial, but I had no idea it would work so quickly and on so many different aspects of my physiology. But I think one of the most important things I learned through fasting was more about my own psychology towards eating. And I think that this is one of the benefits of fasting that's really hard to quantify, and we can't, it's hard to put into a research study, but I definitely think you just learn so much about your eating habits and how food really affects you if you're able to take a fast.
Yeah, I've never been too successful at long-term fasting. I've done 2 attempts, only 3 or 4 days, but I know what you mean, because now, I get hungry, obviously other people do, but hunger is never an emergency anymore. Because if food is delayed, I can get cranky, but I'll go, hey, if I can go 4 days, I can go 4 hours.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
do
you
you
really
think,
learn the difference between a craving and true hunger, I think.
The thing I love most about the fast is that when whatever length it is, when at least for me, when I'm done, not only does healthy food, which is mostly what I eat anyway, taste better, but that's like all I want to eat.
Mhm.
taste
Yeah.
neuroadaptation, we actually did a study that looked at the fact that there really are influences that happen as a consequence of fasting that affect people's perception of fasting and hedonic response to food.
Dr. Myers, do you follow the True North diet regularly? Are you as strict as Dr. Goldhamer?
I'm not as strict as Dr. Goldhamer. I mean, and I'm breastfeeding and I have, I don't gain weight easily. And so, I eat a lot of nuts and things, so my diet is, nobody should take diet advice from me because I can eat a lot of high calorie foods at the moment, probably not for much longer, but yeah, right now.
Didn't I hear like you delivered your own baby or something?
I did, yeah. When I was writing Can Fasting Save Your Life, they call it free birth, but with just me and my partner and my daughter, we delivered my son at home. Yeah.
Oh my God, do you have a video? That's amazing. You can do that, huh? That's
Yeah, that's a pretty intense experience. It's like fasting, actually. If you can like birth your own child and fast, like those are really enlightening experiences.
is so cool. In your bio, it says you've co-authored or authored over 20 peer-reviewed articles. Talk a little bit about what research means, because I think people get confused when they look at research, because like, well, then, the olive oil industry, they do research and they say olive oil is good, for example. So how do we make sense of research?
Yeah, this is a big question, and I think it's complicated. I think science isn't like the truth about things isn't proven in one research paper necessarily, right? And I think with nutrition research in particular, it's difficult because it's based on a lot of epidemiology, and there could be confounding factors that seem to influence things. So I'm sorry. So what would you like me to say more about that?
So,
Well, no, I mean,
one of the things I think we should point out is that research and science itself is a process to try to differentiate fact from fantasy. In other words, you're trying to always figure out what's real and what's accurate. And the scientific methodology is a mathematically based system that's designed to help us do that filtration, help us try to figure out the best way, the most effective way, the most efficient way, the most accurate way. And so if you understand the scientific methodology, you have a better chance of trying to do that filter. It's not a complete or 100% effective or an answer to everything, but it's a process, the most powerful process that humans have ever come up with at trying to differentiate fact from fantasy.
what do you do on a day-to-day basis at True North?
What do? I do a lot of writing still. Right now I'm writing. So we have conducted 5 clinical trials at True North, and we have the last manuscript out for it's under review right now, and so hopefully we get that published. So yeah, I do a lot of writing of manuscripts, revising of manuscripts, writing protocols. I'm also writing a protocol right now. We are going to start testing the safety of a remote fasting intervention that TrueNorth Health Center has been using for the past year or so.
Nice. Do you enjoy working there? I guess you have Dr. Goldhamer right here. So what are you going to say?
Yeah, I was thinking about this today. I feel so grateful for my job. I mean, I work remotely and I have for a while. But I think it's a very rare opportunity that I have, one, to do this type of research. If you look in the literature, other people doing water-only fasting research mostly do it in a metabolic ward if it's done in the US. And there are a few other people in China and some Eastern European countries doing water-only fasting research. But we really have this unique opportunity to do patient-centered water-only fasting research. Most people go at research from a different angle than we have. Like, they're trying to show that something is effective, but water only fasting has been used for thousands of years, and Goldhamer has been using this protocol for over 40 years. So we already have a pretty good idea that it's benefiting health in some way. So we're just trying to quantify it. And it's a little bit different than if we're trying to create a drug to treat something, right? It's a different perspective. It comes with a lot of challenges because we're trying to fit this research into a paradigm of drug research that it doesn't really fit. But I don't know, I'm really grateful for my job because
we have some advantages, AJ, in that we're not dependent on pharmaceutical grants, for example, in order to conduct our research. All of our research currently is funded through the revenues generated by the TrueNorth Health Center, which are given to the foundation to further our mission. So basically, the patients that are undergoing care are funding the research rather than to be depending on, say, a drug company or a government institution, which have their own biases and directions and concerns and influences. And so we're free to follow our consciousness in terms of what we think is the right questions to ask and trying to develop ways of answering those questions, and with much more freedom than you would have if you were working, say, in a university system or if you were dependent on an exogenous sponsor.
Nice. How long did it take you guys to write this book?
ask Alan.
Well,
he's
she's been working
the
on this
task
for many years, and but a particularly concerted effort in the couple of years before publication, which was really, I think, a remarkable event because she was also doing that while she was, you know, she had a young child and she was birthing another child, and I mean, you know, we would be talking and she'd be having contractions. So I mean, I think she was really a hero to be able to get that, all of those processes done and turn out a product that we're really, really happy with. For people that have read Can Fasting Save Your Life, you can see very quickly the amount of work that went into synthesizing all of that different information, publishing the studies that the book is based on, and then actually getting the book written. And as I said, fortunately for us, Dr. Myers has the ability to translate complicated things into understandable writing. And so that's something that's really unusual. A lot of people can do technical writing. Some people are good, popular writers. Very few people can bridge the gap and blend both together well.
Nice. Is this book gotten in the hands of anybody that you were hoping that it got into the hands of?
Well, I think every day, you know, it's like anything in publishing, you know, it's geometric. So every time somebody reads it and then believes it's important, they give it to somebody else, and that process is growing steadily every day. But I can tell that it's having an impact because, like, for example, I just got an invitation today from a group in Lithuania that wants to have a presentation in Lithuania in September. And, you know, they've got a group of 600 people of influence that, you know, are interested in learning about fasting because they read Can Fasting Save Your Life? And I get calls every day from clinicians around the country that have read that book and said, oh, would this help my patient with this or with that? And so, you know, I know it's happening. How quickly it happens, I guess, is hard to predict. But, you know, I'm happy with the fact that, you know, the TrueNorth Health Center has had to continue to grow just in order to keep up with the people that are interested in doing this kind of care. So that's, you know, very different than it was when we started 40 years ago when we were considered criminal quacks.
What other research are you currently doing at TrueNorth? Because I often hear you say that when people fast, they lose the visceral fat as opposed to the subcutaneous fat. And is that something you've studied?
Well,
or is that just
Dr.
something-
Myers' most recent paper, maybe you can tell us about that paper that we're expecting to be coming out shortly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not that people don't lose subcutaneous fat as well, but they do lose quite a large amount of visceral fat, which is the fat that's in the abdominal area, and it's, you know, it's more hypermetabolic. It produces more inflammatory cytokines, and it's more highly associated with cardiovascular disease outcomes than just obesity in general. But we've seen in a range, and so I prepared a little presentation that we could talk about, but just like how to understand if a study is applicable to you, because like, for example, with visceral fat, we see in some population, they continue losing maybe up to 30 or higher 40% of their visceral fat, whereas other people lose a lower percentage. And it really seems like this could be a self-limiting mechanism, just like with high blood pressure. Fasting lowers high blood pressure, but if you have a normal blood pressure, fasting doesn't just keep lowering your blood pressure, you know, indiscriminately. There is a limit. And so there is something really fascinating about fasting that seems to be a really self-limiting mechanism that just does what it sort of needs to do.
Yeah, I'd love to see or hear your presentation. And when patients or anybody in general gain weight back, do they gain it back? Is visceral, subcutaneous, or both?
Yeah, this we haven't measured, but actually one of the so there's some criticisms about fasting, using fasting as weight loss, right? One of the criticisms is that there is a lot of lean mass loss, right? And the other criticism is that you will gain the weight back immediately. And so we have done so one of the very interesting things about our research is we're not just studying the acute fasting period, we are studying, you know, beyond the fasting period. And so we actually have follow-up data of 1 year. And we saw that in those people who came back 1 year later, they had maintained the weight loss or lost more. And so it doesn't seem like people are just gaining back lots of weight. The role of diet in that process, we don't really know. And we haven't done those types of studies where we measure body composition in people who have regained weight.
We do have a study we looked at. This happened to be 3 males where they lost 10 in 2 weeks of fasting, lost 10% of their total weight, 20% of their fat, 40% of their visceral fat, 6% of lean tissue. And at 6-week follow-up, the percentage of body from lean tissue had fully recovered. So the suggestion, at least in those patients, was that they were able to continue to lose fat even as they were regaining their lean mass. And that's, I think, the important thing to consider is, yes, you lose weight, you regain weight back, but the weight you're gaining back is water, fiber, glycogen, and protein primarily. And if you're eating a healthy diet, you're not necessarily regaining fat. In fact, we have evidence that fat loss continues.
Yes, so what we saw is indeed this. So people lose about 75. So of the weight loss during the immediate fasting period, around 70 to 75% is fat-free mass. Fat-free mass includes, you know, skeletal muscle and fluids and connective tissue and other things like this. And so the worry is that if you lose this much lean mass so quickly that you're really causing a detrimental effect to muscle tissue. However, what we saw is that at the end of, say, a 2-week fast, yeah, people lost around 10% of their body weight. But then as we kept looking out, we looked at the end of refeed and we looked at 6 weeks later. What happened was that body weight increased very little, but lean mass or fat-free mass continued to increase and fat mass loss continued as well. So at the end of a 6-week period, we saw that total body weight loss stabilized, but fat-free mass continued to increase and fat mass continued to decrease, such that at the end of 6 weeks, 70% or so of the body weight loss was actually fat mass. And so I think that this really is an interesting phenomena. We don't exactly know why it's happening, but it does suggest that the weight loss during fasting is not detrimental and that the lean mass is quickly recovered. And so in terms of that weight regain, which is a very small amount of weight that's regained during the refeeding, that's mostly fluids replenishment.
Right.
You lose in a typical fast, you're losing a couple pounds of glycogen in your muscles. You're losing water, you know, hydration. You don't have fiber in your gut. That is coming back. So you put glycogen back in your liver and your muscles. You put fluid back in the system. You put some fiber back in the gut. But the point is, if people are willing to continue to eat well, even though their scale is going up, the fat can continue to go down.
Are you studying this just by the data that like the doctors write in the patient's chart, or do you talk to the patients at all when you're doing this research?
Yeah, we do. I mean, I don't actually conduct the research, but yes, we do. We have patient visits, and so when the studies that we've done thus far, we have scheduled research visits in addition to the daily care that the patients are receiving. So the research participants have additional visits where we collect data in a more systematic way.
And for these body mass studies, we were using a DEXA scanner which gives us an accurate assessment of whole body composition.
Nice, nice. Oh, before I forget, Dr. Goldhamer, I do need to announce that if people want to spend the weekend with us at an idyllic place in Mendocino called the Stanford Inn, it's a vegan retreat resort where you can actually bring your dog. There are a few tickets left. That's the weekend of April 3rd, I believe. So check that out. And Dr. Goldhamer will be one of the speakers in Vegas at the Plant Powered Party, and early bird tickets are available only for a few more days. Sorry about that, but I had to get that in. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, we're going to have some fun in Las Vegas, the bastion of healthful living.
Absolutely. But first, we're going to have fun at the Stanford Inn. Have you been there ever, Dr. Goldhamer?
I have, and it's a lovely place for hiking.
Yep.
And they have a vegetarian restaurant that's associated with it. So
Agreements, yeah, and they'll be able to do food your way, and then in between that will be at Rancho La Puerta. So if you want to hang out with Dr. Goldhamer and myself, Dr. Myers, your children, do you raise them eating this way, and have you? And
Yeah, they eat whole foods. Yeah, definitely. They eat whole foods.
lots of it.
nice. Do you live near True North?
I do. I had lived in Vermont for a while. I lived at TrueNorth for a while, which I absolutely loved because I didn't have to cook anything at all, which was great. And then we moved to Vermont, and now I'm living in Northern California. So I'm just a few hours from TrueNorth now.
I live in Northern California. Where do you live?
I live in Miranda.
I don't know that, but I'm in Roseville if you ever want to get together.
Oh, really? Are you on the eastern side?
I don't know. I'm used to Sacramento. I'm not very good at geography, so that's cool. You had mentioned some things. Maybe talk about what the True North Foundation is, because if people ever make a donation, because I don't think a lot of people know that you are a nonprofit, or at least part of your business is.
Yeah, so I think that this is a point of confusion for a lot of people because the center is so popular, so the center and the foundation are two separate entities. And the foundation was formed by Dr. Goldhamer and Dr. Marano in 2011. Like I said, I came on board in 2015 and we really got things moving then. And so our primary focus is conducting clinical research into the effects of prolonged water-only fasting and an exclusively whole plant food diet on human health and physiology. We also educate clinicians in the supervision of prolonged fasting. And the public, we provide evidence-based knowledge on this intervention to the public. And so we're really focused on education and research.
We have a website that's unique to the foundation at fasting.org. And we have our book, Can Fasting Save Your Life, which are two of the principal tools that we have for public education. And then we've got 20 papers that Dr. Myers has published in the scientific literature, which has been very helpful at influencing physicians to think differently about fasting clinically.
Nice. Okay,
The center, if you think about it, the center is kind of the human subjects laboratory for the foundation's research work. In order for the foundation to do research, they have to have a place where people can safely fast under medical supervision. And that's the service that TrueNorth Health Center provides. We're able to do medically supervised water-only fasting in a controlled setting safely and effectively. So these questions can be asked in a safe and effective way.
So what you're saying is when we go to the TrueNorth Health Center, we're basically one of your lab rats.
You are essentially one of our lab rats. Well, yeah. Not exactly.
Yeah, not exactly. So, I mean, research is very regulated, right? And so everybody who is participating in a study, they provide informed consent. But I do want to say that I just want to put a big thank you of gratitude to the TrueNorth Health Center patients. Without the patients and their generosity and their willingness to be involved in studies, we would never have achieved what we have achieved. I mean, there are almost no small foundations doing this type of research. Clinical research is so expensive, but I think this is another place that Alan and I are a really good team. Like we can bootstrap things. We do things as efficiently and economically as we can. And but the patients have been just so important to our success. So
one of the disadvantages to I think our operation is that it's so much more difficult for a person like Dr. Myers because she has to do everything. She has to design the study. She has to, write the papers up. She has to conduct the research. In a normal academic setting, there'd be a whole team of people that would be working at pushing this through. And that's partly why it would be so expensive, because you'd have all kinds of professionals that would be on board, where we have Dr. Myers, and then we contract, specialist services as needed for statisticians or whatever. And as a consequence, we're able to produce papers for a fraction of the cost that it would cost if you were doing it through, say, a university or institution. Think about this. RFK recently pushed through a proposal that they're going to try to limit to 15% any grant for overhead. But a typical institution may be spending 60 or 70% of their grant money in the past for overhead. So it's creating major problems for university-based research, because they can't operate as efficiently. And as a consequence, we're in a better position now because we have such a contained and controlled overhead. We're able to take on things that would be impractical financially to be done in a university-based setting.
Great. I'm going to ask a real specific question about the research, doctors, as soon as I can open my
I just want to make one other point. One of the things that Dr. Myers did when she joined us is we were having trouble with the human subject committees at conventional universities approving research because they were so terrified of the idea of people fasting. They felt that, somebody not eating for that period of time would have too high a mortality. And so we were running into a lot of problems. Well, one of the things that we did was we helped sponsor the formation of a federally chartered IRB that, was staffed by people that were knowledgeable in fasting to make that evaluation more possible and to protect human safety, but also to, do it with people that understood the risks and benefits of fasting.
Thank you. Dr. Myers, can you talk about, you'd mentioned about possible topics, and I don't even know what p-value means, but I've heard the word statistical versus clinical significance, absolute versus relative change. How are these things important to understand for people and to use appropriately when they're interested in scientific research, especially if it's to inform their healthcare decision-making?
Yeah, so I have a little presentation which may be easier just because these are kind of complex topics. And of course, using science to inform health care choices, it's a tricky business, and typically it's done with, a lot of evidence over time. And of course, if we're talking about drugs, it's a whole different ballgame. But there are ways that you can look or approach a research study, especially in a field like fasting, where there's not a lot of systematic reviews or a lot of data, and see like, well, is this applicable to me? Can I, use this in my life?
Well, I'd love to see it. I've enabled screen share if you want
Okay.
to.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah, so okay, here we go. Yeah, so using science to inform. So I think like if you're trying to use a research study to inform your healthcare choices, you have to start with a few simple questions. Like, one, does this study apply to me? Are the results meaningful, and are the results real? And you can look at meaningful or real, in either order, but I think these are like the basic questions I would start asking. And so I was just going to use two separate manuscripts that we've published, and they're very they're similar in the fact is like what is studied. We are studying prolonged fasting followed by whole plant food refeeding, but the populations are separate. One is a paper with just 7 normal weight, metabolically healthy females, younger females, and the other study, the 6-week follow-up, the green study here, that is with people who have overweight or obesity. They are, metabolically unhealthy, and it's a much larger study. There's over 30 people. And so the way that we approach these two studies is very different. And so if we're asking, does the study apply to me? Like, so I wouldn't.
Oh, did you freeze up? I can't hear you right now.
She's frozen up right now. You're also frozen up right now, AJ.
Okay. Let me unfreeze I think I can unfreeze myself. Am I better?
You're better now, but we need
Uh-oh.
to unfreeze Dr. Myers.
You're in a different location. Oh boy, this is, can you text her? I don't know if she knows she's frozen.
Okay.
I can put something in the chat. Sorry about that, guys, because this is very interesting. Of course, it would happen right during the PowerPoint. Yeah, her video does look frozen. You
Okay.
text her, and yeah, I think she's still going with it, but we can't hear her.
So let me.
Thanks for hanging in
Oh,
there.
now you're back, Tasha.
I'm so sorry. It's raining here today and we have a satellite. So it's,
So
sometimes.
just see if you can log back into it. That was good.
Yeah, it's raining here too. Well, we both live in Northern California.
Okay, so
Good. Yeah, you're back. You're back in
let me
action.
share the screen again here real quick. Okay. Yeah, so then we're gonna ask, does this study apply to me? And how would you do that? So ideally you could read the abstract, which should be really straightforward to.
Yeah. So
And then you
most
can ask, like, what is being studied? So in the case of our research, we're studying prolonged water only fasting. But sometimes it's from a different perspective. So for example, in those papers, we're studying prolonged water only fasting and we're looking at the effects on cardiometabolic markers. However, if you are looking at the effects of fasting for follicular lymphoma, that paper wouldn't really apply to you. You would need to find a different study. And then, so you're asking, what are the population's health characteristics? And then what are the population's demographics? Is it women? Is it men? What are the age? And yeah, and you can sort of see, like, is this study applying to me in this way?
And that becomes relevant because a lot of studies are done without, say, on men, but not on women. Yeah. Or they're done on certain age populations, and it can be very different depending on the demographics in terms of what the outcome is. In fact, that's one of the real problems is though they typically pick studies oftentimes based on where they're going to make the most money.
I feel like I'm having a bit of a delay. So if you determine, like, yes, I'm interested in fasting. Yes, this population is similar to me. Yes, this population has a similar health problem or health characteristics that I'm interested in learning about. Then you can go on and look at the results. And I just feel like this is okay. And so in those two papers I mentioned, we studied a lot of different cardiometabolic markers, and one of them is fatty liver index. So fatty liver index is just a validated estimate of liver function. It incorporates body mass index, waist circumference, triglycerides, and GGT, which is gamma glutamyl transferase, which is a liver enzyme. And so basically there's an equation and it uses these and you get a score. So if your score is less than 30, it's probable that you have normal liver function. If it's greater than 30, you may have reduced liver function. And if it's greater than 60, you may have liver disease. It's not exactly accurate, but that's the general idea. And so when we're looking at outcomes, people often present the outcomes in two different ways. They present it as an absolute value or a relative value. And the media is really big on presenting relative values of change because they look humongous and really like there's a huge effect, but you have to actually look at the absolute value of the change. And then you also have to use some discernment in the end after all. So if we look at the relative change in fatty liver index in that metabolically unhealthy population, which was around 30 people of mixed population, there was a 28% reduction in fatty liver index. If we look at the metabolically healthy population, there was a 36% reduction in fatty liver index. And it's like, whoa, that's huge. Like the healthy people have an even greater effect than the unhealthy people. However, if we look at the absolute change, it tells you a whole different story. So these figures are a little bit complicated. The one here on the left with all of the colorful dots, this is the unhealthy population. And this is a box plot. And so basically, if you look at the black line in the middle of these plots, it's the median value of all of those little dots are individuals. The red dots, that's the 60, so that's the cutoff. So all those people above that red line at the top likely are developing liver disease. The people at the bottom, they might be healthy, and then there's these people in the middle who have some impaired function. And so you can see at the baseline, the first box plot there, the median fatty liver index was above 60. It was like 67 or something for these people. And if you look at the follow-up, it's gone down to in the 40s. So even though the relative change was only like 28%, this is a much more clinically meaningful change than if you look at the metabolically healthy people over here. You can see their fatty liver index doesn't even reach anywhere near the cutoff for impaired function. However, it does still reduce quite dramatically at the end of fasting and the end of follow-up, 36%. However, so you can see, so even though the relative change in the healthy people was much larger, the actual absolute change was much greater in the metabolically unhealthy group, and it's much more clinically meaningful. I'm going to stop there. And do you have any questions?
Let me see if the audience has any questions, and I'll go over there for the chat. I think it's just hard for lay people to understand research in general, you know?
Yeah, it is very hard. And I mean, and not just, you know, lay people. And I'll continue on and I'll just tell a few examples of like what I'm talking about. Like one thing, so I mean, just to start, like there's so many publications published every single day. Like even professionals can't keep up with like the huge amount of literature that is there. And so before you even get started looking at a study, you have to understand, like, is this study well conducted? You know, how is that data collected? Who is conducting the study? There's all of these questions even before you get to the data analysis. So it is a really overwhelming thing. For people to just follow the science, as they say.
On this absolute and relative, you know, for example, with vaccination for influenza, which is pushed so hard, people, they say, oh, if you get vaccinated for the flu, there's a 50% reduction in your chance of getting flu. And that may be technically true, but the absolute reduction is you reduce your risk from 2% to 1%. So if you said to somebody, well, if you don't get vaccinated, you have a 2% chance of getting the flu. And if you get vaccinated, you have a 1% chance in the flu. There's 1 in 100 less people getting the flu with vaccination. That doesn't sound as impressive as you say, oh, you have a 50% reduction. So there's a huge difference. And that's why they use the terms the way they do, to try to manipulate and influence people in the direction they're desiring, rather than just giving them, you know, an accurate perception of what's really going on.
One thing I think that you mentioned that's interesting is you're not being funded by like a drug company to do the research or a food product company. You're funding your own research.
Well, our patients, through participating in the TrueNorth Health Center, ultimately are the source of our funding.
Nice, nice. Did you ever study any, did you want to keep your slides up, Doctor?
For example, when people buy Can Fasting Save Your Life, neither Dr. Myers nor myself accrue any economic benefit from that. All that is a product that's produced by the TrueNorth Health Foundation, and all proceeds accrue to the TrueNorth Health Foundation.
I just wanted to say, so this is, I just wanted to finish up. So this is how you could sort of tell, like, is it meaningful? So you have to look at what the change is, what the change is telling you, you know, and then you can say, well, is this even real? And determining realness is not as easy, it's not really easy, right? But what you can do is, one, look at the quality of the study design. Then you can also ask, are the data statistically significant? And this is where the p-value comes in. And this is where everybody's crazy about p-value, but maybe a lot of people don't really understand. So a p-value just simply informs if the results are due to chance. And so a common threshold for a p-value is 0.05. That just says that there's a 5% chance it's not due to chance, so that the observed result is unlikely to happen under the null hypothesis. It does not confirm that the hypothesis is true, and it doesn't indicate whether the effect is clinically meaningful. So a lot of people are really crazy about p-values, but you really need to start with a hypothesis-driven study. And for example, the studies that we've conducted at TrueNorth Health Foundation so far have not been hypothesis-driven. They have been observational in nature, and we are gearing up to conduct a hypothesis-driven study comparing fasting to standard of care or comparing fasting to diet, because this is one gray area for our research. But what you can do instead of using p-values, which we often do, is use something called a confidence interval. And so it gives you an estimated range of what the effect should be if you do it a bunch of times. So 95% of the time you should have the effect within this value, these values. And so it tells you the magnitude and the certainty. It doesn't tell you the significance. So you can run a p-value to a significance test on top of that. But so these are tables from our studies, and you can see it's very complicated. There's a lot of data you have to figure out. But for fatty liver index here, you can see you see these changes, and oh, sorry about that. But nevertheless, what I'm trying to get at is we present our data as 95% confidence intervals because you can see the true range. If the range is narrow, it's likely to be true, but doesn't cross zero, it's likely to be, true. But even though we do this very complicated statistical modeling for our papers, which is the right way, researchers are still asking us, where's the p-value? Even though, like with a sample of 7, like I didn't even run any statistics for that small population because it doesn't make any sense to do so, because you can have misleading information if you have too small of a sample size. And even if you have too large, that's what drug companies often do, right? They enroll thousands and thousands of people. They see a very small effect, but guess what? It's statistically significant just by the nature that there were like so many thousands of people enrolled. So yeah, so overall, it is very complicated to use science to inform your healthcare choices. And ultimately, in the end, you have to have a lot of discernment. Because, for example, with the healthy population that we had, we saw this trend towards improved biomarkers, but they were all within the reference range. However, if you think about health worsening incrementally over time due to prolonged exposure to ultra-processed foods or whatever it is that you're doing, a yearly fast may actually be beneficial if it reduces your FLI by 50%, even if it's just a small change, because you don't want to continue increasing your fatty liver index each year, right? And so, yeah, so I guess all of this just to say that, like, understanding science is quite complicated, and you also have to use discernment, even with all of these tools.
Thank you.
You have to take everything with a grain of kelp.
Yes, everything.
So do you ever study anything that's not related to fasting, but things that you believe in, like, for example, the time-restricted feeding?
Time-restricted feeding. Well, I've studied a lot of the literature on that. I mean, we sort of do study time-restricted feeding at the center, right? Because people are only eating between, 8 and 5 or something like this.
So,
But
it's
honestly,
been a part of
I
our
think
program.
the time-restricted eating that I've seen, they haven't been, very profound. It seems, yeah, it's more the quality of what you're eating over a long period of time.
Well, one thing we know is just time-restricted feeding without discernment of what you're eating is not effective. So the idea that, oh, you can eat whatever you want as long as you restrict it is nonsense. So is time-restricted feeding a useful clinical tool to improve people's diet and lifestyle? Maybe, that has to be determined. But we know that you can't just rely on time-restricted feeding to get healthy. If you're eating crap, you're going to still pay the price.
This is just a fun question that has nothing to do with research, but one of the viewers is saying, what was the craziest contraband you ever found at TrueNorth? Because when I've been there, I see people sneaking out to the store across the street. I mean, I've seen people eat ribs and chicken and coffee, never beer, Coca-Cola. Like, I know that you don't do a sweep in the rooms like they do in prison, but have you ever found anything that was just really frightening?
Well, we have a mix of patients, and we also have sometimes patients who are there with guests. So that, for example, you may have a companion who's not necessarily there to do fasting and stuff, but accompanying their mate or whatever. And so there is quite a bit of variance in behavior amongst some of our individuals. With fasting patients, we have a little bit more control. We're examining them twice a day, we're testing them. So we sometimes do notice that. I'll give you an example. we had a patient, one of our first patients actually at the new facility was a woman who was supposed to go to a nursing home, but the kids said the nursing home wasn't available. Could she stay with us till the bed became available? She came in, and every day we fed her the program, and she lost weight. And she actually lost 2 pounds a week for 26 weeks. She was down about 52 pounds. They ended up deciding to have her stay with us because it was so much more affordable than the nursing home, and she was getting well and whatnot. But one day we noticed she only lost 1 pound that week instead of the average 2 pounds. And I made a suggestion to the interns that she must be cheating and eating something that she shouldn't have. And the interns were saying, oh, no, she wouldn't cheat. She's totally into the program. But, when we went into her room and I talked to her, I said, I think, there's something not making sense about this data. And she admitted that she had bought a bag of salted peanuts at the store when she was going over to the gym, and she was just having a few. We took the peanuts away from her, and then she was back to 2 pounds a week until she actually ultimately lost 100 pounds during the first year. And that was without fasting. That was just healthy eating. And at that point, she was off 11 of her 12 medications. We fasted her for 10 days, normalized her blood pressure. The woman never did go to the nursing home. She ended up going home and taking care of the daughter that sent her in. But the point was, even the most compliant patients, sometimes there can be some variation, but typically it'll start to show up in their outcome data. So if they get too far out of line, then we give them a hard time about it.
That's so interesting. Well, the reason I asked you about intermittent fasting is because we both know Dr. John Scharfenberg, who's going to be 102 this year, and he's also going to be speaking at the Vegas conference, the Plant Powered Party, with you. And he swears one of the reasons for his longevity is that he doesn't eat dinner.
So I think the dietary excess is a principal contributing cause to death and disability. Anything you do that might help reduce dietary excess is likely to benefit clinically some outcome. And we know that he's, a disciplined eater and avoids excess eating. And that, I'm sure, is a contributing factor, not to mention good genetics and luck.
Yep. Elizabeth would like to know, have you ever had experience with fasting helping eye issues, specifically something called CRVO, central retinal vein occlusion?
I don't know if I don't think we've documented any specific cases of central vein occlusion. So I don't know that we have any hard data. And I would really have to go back to our data to see whether, how many patients we've had and what the outcomes are. Until you've actually published stuff, it's all anecdotal information and isn't as meaningful. The exercise we have to go through to actually get a case report through Dr. Myers and then ultimately presented to the scientific literature is really quite arduous. And it requires a higher level of specificity than you would see in normal clinical monitoring of patients. We're monitoring everybody carefully for their safety and their outcome, but to really be able to publish a case report or publish a study requires a much higher level of discipline and focus. And so I hate to really talk too much about anecdotal case experience unless we've had a lot of cases, because even if we had seen somebody that's had good improvement, it doesn't mean it's going to be generalized. For example, we have one patient with type 1 diabetes who did respond and still remains stable off insulin, but it's a rare outlier and likely a misdiagnosis rather than, a miracle. So I think we should really look at our published papers for a high degree of reliability when we start making claims about specific conditions.
But I think what you're saying just reminded me of something really important is that, even with with the case reports and the anecdotal evidence, like the N of 1, I think those stories are inspiring and they show like the wide breadth of the possibility of fasting as a therapeutic intervention, but they may not necessarily apply to you, and we don't know if it's generalizable. But with the studies also, what we're seeing are means, and we see a huge effect sizes within those populations. And so I think you should take this data with a grain of salt. And, if something suggests like, oh, well, it looks kind of hopeless for me because of this data, like that's not necessarily true, because
Right.
You're an individual and that is like looking at a median value. And so it's really important to, really follow your own discernment and your healthcare professional's advice, because it's really hard.
one of the challenges that since most doctors in many conditions never see anybody get well, like for example, we know from weight loss that the success of the traditional medical approach at helping people lose weight and keep it off is dismally low. It's lower in some cases than treating drug addiction, which is also dismally low. That doesn't mean people can't lose weight and keep it off. In fact, we see that routinely. So, like you said, you have to remember, health results from healthful living. It's diet, sleep, exercise. Maybe fasting can be a tool as well. And it's remarkable how many people we've seen that weren't supposed to be able to get well that did get well. And so, you start developing a certain amount of optimism by seeing people get well. But just because somebody else got well doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to respond in the same way. The reason we're
Or
doing
just because
science,
somebody else didn't get well doesn't mean that you
exactly.
won't.
Exactly. Just because the doctor tells you, oh, nobody ever gets better from high blood pressure, you have to be on these drugs the rest of your life, there's nothing can be done, quit asking questions. That doesn't mean that's true. And in fact, in our experience, we see the vast majority with essential hypertension will normalize their blood pressure if they're willing to do the diet, sleep, and exercise.
Yeah, well, that brings me to the month that we did the 31 days of thriving in the face of cancer. People should never give up hope, even if, you know what I mean?
Right.
But
no question. And again, you don't need to necessarily have a miracle. You just need to be one of the percentage that there always are of people that end up doing well long term. You just need to try to put yourself in the best position to be one of those people and hope for the best on that.
But didn't you once have a patient that like practically was blind and walked out sighted?
Yeah, we
But
did
just
have a
diet.
patient that was clinically, in fact, we published her case report and she did recover her vision, although that was not involving fasting. That was just from the dietary and lifestyle changes that was resulted in her ability to regain better functional, and she never did have to have the transplant that was recommended. But think about that. That was nothing to do with fasting. That was just adopting a whole plant food diet and giving enough time to make it happen.
That's fantastic. Let's see. Here's a question from Elijah. Dr. Goldhamer, I follow your counsel on autophagy, 18-hour daily fasts, sometimes 42. What caloric or osmolar values trigger the cessation of autophagy? For example, is tea sweetened with the liquid from steamed cucumbers and pumpkin a deal breaker? As I prepare food during periods of fasting, I often hear your voice saying, "You get nothing."
Well, remember, autophagy is always going on. It's just how the body gets rid of aged cells, decrepit cells, clears debris. The question is, what can you do to increase that, or what can you do to decrease that tendency? Dr. Myers maybe should talk to us about what autophagy actually is, and then we can address the clinical things that might influence it.
Yeah, so autophagy is just a mechanism that the body has to remove damaged cells and proteins and so forth. And it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of information about autophagy and fasting. I just want to point out that there is no direct measure of autophagy in humans. We don't know how much you need to fast to increase autophagy by X% or something like this. Anybody who tells you that they know that, I will say that they're wrong. I have never seen that data. So I'm not saying that I don't, it's not that I don't think fasting causes autophagy in humans. I just haven't seen direct evidence of that. And so I think we should just keep everything in perspective. There's a lot of research in animals and it may or may not apply to humans.
Do you ever study like which patients are going to be successful once they leave? Because, some people aren't. I mean, they go back to what they were eating before.
Yeah, we actually did a study trying to look at psychometric factors to see if it was influencing. We looked at conscientiousness, for example, trying to discern that. But this is really complicated. It turns out people are not exactly the same, say, as rats. And predicting human behavior may not be as predictive as predicting rodent behavior or other types of creatures. And so it's challenging trying to determine who's going to do well, who's going to not do well. I have noticed a few things observationally. One is that people that are heavily motivated tend to do better than people that are not motivated. And one of the best motivations in my experience is pain, debility, and fear of death. So I find people that are dying or suffering greatly oftentimes are much more focused and willing to do dangerous and radical things like eat well and exercise and go to bed on time than people that are just maybe motivated by superficial issues of, aesthetic weight loss or something like that. So the patients we have the best long-term success with do oftentimes are the most motivated. Now, recently, we've been seeing more patients that are motivated by health prevention and health promotion. So healthy people that for whatever reason have decided they want to stay healthy instead of waiting like everybody else till they get sick and then try to apply medical intervention that may not necessarily make them live longer or better, but just cost them a lot of money. So I'm optimistic that what we're doing is as helpful as it is in sick people. I think the people that may ultimately be proven to get the most benefit from this approach are healthy people that are wanting to stay healthy and avoid the 16 years of debility that the average person experiences at the end of their life. We may not necessarily be able to make people live a lot longer than their genetic potential, but we may be able to help them live until they die. And hopefully they have a good life and a good death where they go to bed and don't wake up, rather than spend years debilitated as a consequence of preventable or delayable disease.
Thank you. One of the things I found really interesting about this book is, I mean, the references alone take up like several pages. So it's obviously everything is well cited and well researched. There's just like, I don't know, 20 pages, I think, of references. More, maybe.
I would just like to say like some of the interesting projects that we're going to start in the next year, if you're interested, because we have found a lot of interesting things in the past 10 years. But I think there's a few key areas that stand out. One is this continued fat loss after fasting. Nobody has shown that before. And so that's a really interesting area, like, and also this decrease in fatty liver index. There's currently no medications to treat fatty liver disease. And so it really seems that fasting is effective at this. And we hope to quantify this more with some ultrasound and other types of studies. And it may be related to the visceral fat loss that we see as well. The other areas that we are interested in is trying to determine if fasting is beneficial for healthy people over the long term. Of course, as you know, as you saw from those studies I just showed you, in healthy people, the changes are much smaller. So we need to really quantify that over a decade or something for people, if repeated fasting every year can actually help prevent disease progression. So fatty liver, continued fat loss. Also, we've seen some interesting things with people with long COVID. And so, perhaps fasting can help people who are suffering from long COVID and post-vaccination issues. And so, yeah, we're going to move in this area, and with the remote fasting as well, because that's another issue, right? Like, there's so many people who could potentially benefit from fasting, but TrueNorth Health Center can only fast so many people a year.
We've
and
also
so with
got a
remote
couple
fasting, there's a much higher, greater opportunity for access.
We've also published a couple case reports now looking at one of the cardiometabolic risk factors, lipoprotein(a), which doesn't come down with drugs at all and doesn't come down much with say, dietary change alone. But it has, at least in a few of our patients, come down dramatically with fasting. And so now we're studying more patients, and we're seeing it over and over again. I've just had a few more follow-ups this week that are demonstrating significant changes in this significant cardiometabolic risk factor. And so eventually we'll hopefully be able to put a cohort of a larger number of patients together, and then that may be really novel. They do have a drug they're introducing to try to treat that, but it's early in its stages of development, and it'll undoubtedly have a whole host of side effects, as most medications do. So, there's lots of exciting potential there that we can focus our research efforts on.
That's great. Have you done that study yet? You were doing one in conjunction with Kaiser on high blood pressure. Has that happened yet? And
we've been trying to negotiate with outside groups, but one of the roadblocks we've run into is they're very concerned about whether this approach with diet and fasting can be scaled, if it's economically viable for them, i.e., how are they going to make money on it? And so I've been a little bit surprised. Even the research organizations within these HMOs seem to be dominantly controlled by their economic concerns, rather than just trying to understand, how to get sick people well. So it's a little bit disappointing, but we're going to continue to work on ways of making it of interest to them, and this remote research may make it what they would consider more practical. So perhaps that'll reignite the interest in our work.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you both so much. It was so nice meeting you, Dr. Myers, and congratulations on writing such a wonderful, much needed book so that people can just give this to their doctor and not have to try to explain it themselves. Yeah, it's interesting, Dr. Goldhamer, how, a lot of even doctors don't, even with this book, they kind of don't believe it,
Well, and a doctor that actually reads the book will come away with the impression that, okay, there's some science, and it does tend to appeal. I've had a number of physicians call that have read it, that it said it's really shifted their view about fasting. And it doesn't mean they're going to be powerful advocates for fasting, but they may be more willing to tolerate and support patients that are interested in actually getting well. And that's what one of the designs of the book is, to not just help patients understand all about fasting, but to help their doctors understand what they're doing so they can be less ignorant.
Right. You want to tell people how they can apply to be a patient at the TrueNorth Health Center?
Well, we offer a free service, which is a phone conversation with me to point people in the right direction. All they have to do is go to healthpromoting.com, complete the registration forms, and I'll look forward to speaking with them.
Great. And can people still get a signed copy of the book on your website? Signed by you?
They can get the book from Amazon. They can get it from our website. If they put in a request for a signed copy, we'll be more than happy to make sure they get that.
Great. Well, I'm going to just ask you a fun question, Dr. Myers, because we get every guest that's been on the show gets this. What do you eat in a day?
Oh, what do I eat in a day? Oh my gosh. Well, I typically start the day with a smoothie and oats, and then sometimes I don't eat lunch because I'm busy, which is not great. And then for dinner, we just eat, like lots of like curries and rice and vegetables. We live in a place where there's a lot of people growing food, so we have access to local Whole Foods, and yeah, so lots of smoothies, salads, stir fries, rice, the potatoes.
Nice. Well, thank you. So nice to meet you. And thank you, Dr. Goldhamer.
Nice to see you, AJ.
Right. Nice to see you, and nice to see all of you. And please come back Friday at 10 a.m. when my guest is Dr. Matt Letterman. We're going to give you an update on my recent cancer treatment at Stanford, and then have another show at 2 o'clock that day. So talk about not giving up hope. I will have Dr. Goldhamer, a 17-year pancreatic cancer survivor, 17 years.
Only 33 to go.
Right. But here's the thing. We're going to talk about his journey and what he does now. He has a camp to send adults, kind of like Make-A-Wish, to with cancer. So guess who wants to go to camp? Me. If I